So students, today's lecture will be the concluding lecture for Manik Bandyopadhyay's The Final Solution. And once again, in today's lecture, like in the previous ones, I'm going to discuss several aspects related to the story, right? So we have covered several themes. So far, we have talked about partition. We have also spoken about social capital, cultural capital, and the difference that these concepts have with economic capital. These are some things that you already know, and in the aspect of from the perspective of this story, you already know that social capital or the absence of social capital becomes a very important contributor to the situation Mallika falls in, right? And a person like Promotho, and we have spoken about Promotho as a capitalist, as someone who tries to make profit out of the worst situations that human beings can fall in. We have spoken about Promotho in those terms as well. So we have covered several aspects of the story, from themes to important characters such as Promotho and Mallika, and some theoretical elements as well, such as social capital, right? So we had also had a look at what a riot is, or what the partition is, and what it means from the point of view of experience, to have experienced something like a riot or a partition. So these are some of the aspects we have covered in the previous classes, and in today's lecture, the things that I am going to focus on are going to be diverse, perhaps a bit more diverse than in the previous lectures. And the first point that I'm going to begin with today is what this story documents. So, at its core, right, basically, this story, The Final Solution, documents women's response, right? Women's response to what? To a cataclysmic episode or event like partition. Now, partition, of course, by now you already know that it is not a minor event. You are studying an entire paper on partition, so you are already familiar with several other texts which already tell you that partition was not just a simple episode, right? It was a major event, it was an upheaval, it was a disaster, a cataclysm, right? I could go on and on with adjectives, but the point is, I'm sure you already know from this paper and from your own knowledge of the events before and after partition, that this was surely a cataclysmic event, right? So this story, as I was saying, documents women's response to such a cataclysm, such as partition, right? Now, in what ways does this documentation take place, right? So the first point in today's lecture is about documentation of the partition, and we are looking at documentation from the perspective of women, right? Or rather, we are noting women's response to something such as the partition. Okay. Now that said, let us look at what are these things that are documented. Now, within the larger event of partition, what are some, more micro level observations that can be made from this story, right? So, like I said, it documents women's response, sometimes with women's willful amnesia of the violation. Now, what is willful amnesia? Amnesia, as you know, is loss of memory, right? Often called, I think, short-term memory loss. Do not quote me on these terms, because I may not be using them very accurately. But amnesia basically means loss of memory. Whether it's long-term or short-term is a different matter altogether. But let's talk about what willful amnesia means, and what does willful amnesia of violation means, right? Now come to this story, or take the example of other partition related stories that you have read, specifically those which have women as the protagonists, right? So with that in mind, think about memory of women, and specifically the fact that women, despite having been violated, despite having been subjected to a lot of violence, to a lot of aggression from society, from specifically from men perhaps, right? Despite that, they often do something called willful amnesia, right? So basically, the woman has suffered something, but she deliberately forgets that, deliberately shuts off that part of the memory which has those experiences of being violated, right? So this is one of the important aspects that these texts bring forward. Okay. Now the second is the appropriation of male roles as breadwinners. Now, uh, I'm sure you have read the story by now, and if you have, you already know that at the very beginning of the story, we find the entire family, Mallika's family, at a railway station, right? We find them. Let's forget the railway station. Just think of it as a refugee camp, temporary refugee camp, where there are many of these refugees who have come from the other side of the border. Now they have no jobs, obviously. Many of them are sick. They certainly do not have much food, and there are capitalists. Now, specifically capitalists in the sense that I have introduced you to in the previous lecture. So there are, let's just call them predators or land sharks, because that's what they are. That's what a person like Prometho is, right? So he's just a predator. He's just waiting for his next prey, and he thinks that Mallika and her sister-in-law could be that prey. So Prometho finds them. He sees the helplessness of this family, finds out that the husband is suffering from something like malaria, some kind of a disease, and is not even being able to stand up on his own feet. So the point being that the breadwinner of the family is sick and these women are helpless, right? And that is what enables or creates a fertile ground for a person like Prometho to come and exploit these women, right? Now you see the basic. Now what is the problem? Why is this so important? Why is this fact important? It's because traditionally society sees men as the breadwinners, right? So when the story begins, we do not see Mallika being particularly enthusiastic about working, right? Remember, in one portion of the story, and this I'm saying assuming that you have read it, early on in the story, when Prometho comes and talks to Mallika, she does point out at one instance, she asks, "Why don't you give my husband a job? Isn't there a job for my husband?" Right. So once again, you see that narrative or uh, or the social, the practice or the tradition that men will be the breadwinners, that has stayed here as well. And the fact that the bread man is the breadwinner and the breadwinner is sick creates a fertile ground for the exploitation of women to happen, right? Now if that assumption is taken away, if the consideration or the tradition of men being the breadwinners is taken away, then as you can see, the possibility of that violation, of that exploitation, automatically gets reduced, right? So this is also a theoretical point I'm making. These are things which can be elaborated and discussed within the purview of feminism, ecofeminism, etc. There are other branches as well, but yes, these things can be brought into consideration. We can also discuss these things in the context of the final solution. Now let's look at some of the other documentations of response here. Okay, so so the third would be as anchors to the family in the state of helplessness, right? So women are often seen as anchors to the family in the state of helplessness, and that is very evident in this story, right? Because from the onset of the story, it's quite evident that Mallika's husband is in no state to go back to being the breadwinner in anytime soon, and it is all dependent on Mallika. She has to negotiate and decide. So not only the decision is hers, if she has to negotiate with someone, she has to do it. Her husband won't be able to do it because he's not in a position to do so, right? Now, one more important point is transgression to sustain their family from the state of abject poverty. So once again, this is a point that becomes very evident during the course of the story, because what is transgression is one important question that you might ask here. The answer to which is there's a very simple answer to that. Obviously, there are more complex answers, but let's look at the simple answer first. transgression in a very traditional sense, or in a very commonplace plebeian sense, would imply that when there is a boundary set by society to you or me or anyone, and once we cross that boundary, that act of crossing the boundary is called a transgression, right? So now, does any transgression happen in this story? Again, we are going by the simple definition of it. And the simple answer would be yes, because you see, the man is the breadwinner, right? Bread earner, winner, whichever way you look at it, traditionally. But here, the man is in no place to do so. And therefore, the woman, Mallika, has to step forward. In fact, she has to take a leap, and she has to now be the breadwinner. She has to now save the family from the state of abject poverty, right? And she also kinds of adopts a changing gender role here, right? Because she is the one who does the job of a breadwinner, in other words, does the job of the man, right? So that's how we are looking at it here. So, and she also shows characteristics, attributes that is traditionally associated with men, right? Such as practicality, patience, courage. She displays all of these at the end of the story, right? In fact, throughout the story, but mostly so at the end of the story, during her final act of taking her revenge on Prometho, right? And during her act of revenge, not only does she flaunt courage, she shows a great deal of practicality. Remember, she is able to plan her action. She is able to think through the entire process of the deed, and she successfully manages to, execute her plan of revenge as well. And she is also patient throughout. So all these qualities are often associated with men, and the point that Manik Bandyopadhyay is perhaps making with the final solution is that the very idea that certain roles and certain qualities belong to men is wrong, because these qualities, as this story shows, is also there in women. As you can see, the larger point of the story, because remember, Manik Bandyopadhyay is an emancipatory writer. He does not believe in the traditional idea of men and women being different, of men being the masters of women, right? Now, whether or not he's a feminist is a different question, right? But he certainly believes that the qualities which are traditionally associated with men are certainly not absent in women, right? In fact, in his protagonist, Mallika, those qualities are very much present. So Mallika becomes the bread earner, right? She saves her family from abject poverty. She also adopts changing gender roles, right? By becoming the breadwinner, but by also displaying courage, practicality, and patience. All right. So moving on, I think quite appropriately, this story stands as a reflection of a microcosm in a macrocosm, right? So I will read out one quotation from Urvashi Butalia, and Urvashi Butalia is someone I think you must have heard of from the other teachers who are teaching you this paper, partition, because she is a very prominent scholar who has written a lot about partition, specifically about the Punjab partition, about the Punjab side of the story. So that is her area of specialization. In fact, there have been films which are actually derived from her works. So there was one film, I can't recall the name right away, but I will tell you once I am able to remember it, which was based on the work of Urvashi Butalia, right? But there is a very important book that she has written, The Other Side of Silence. Someone may have mentioned this to you already, but if you're coming across this book name for the first time, well and good, find it out, read about it. If you are not able to read the book, read about the book. So that will give you an idea, right? So one quote from her. So the quote goes as follows: Partition was surely just a political divide or a division of properties, of assets and liabilities. It was also, to use a phrase that survivors use repeatedly, a division of hearts, right? So she's saying that Well, partition was obviously division of properties, assets, liabilities, but it was also the division of hearts. Okay, so it's a very important quotation. Maybe you should mention it somewhere in your answers. Okay, so a few more words before we end our lessons for this story. So, one specific instance from the story is what I'll pick up now. And this is the situation where, confronted with violence, Mallika turns out to be a heroic figure who doesn't give up in the face of calamities. Now, in her case, those calamities are brought by devilish capitalist forces who are hell bent to dispossess and degrade her identity. But she does not give up, right? And when we say she does not give up, again, remember the terms that I used previously. She is not only courageous, she's practical, and she is very patient. Now, all those qualities coming together results in the protagonist we know Mallika to be, right? So the final act of retribution should be seen as, or could be seen rather, as the possible alternative to the disorder in the absence of the normal or modal social order, right? And ending of the story, um, the ending of the story evokes a sense of shock and bewilderment, but has a plausible justification despite its unnaturalness and unexpectedness. In the end, Mallika's calm and composed response puts to rest all misgivings about the appropriateness of her conduct, right? Because if you have read the story, um, one question I want to leave you with is related to what I just spoke to you about, right? Because this question is: was she right in killing Promotho in the end, in essentially murdering, right? And can she be forgiven for it? Was she justified? So these are all important questions, and finding out those answers should be your response to reading this text, right? So I will end our classes on the final solution by Manik Bandyopadhyay here today. I will also share a PPT with you, and that PPT will contain most of the things I have spoken about. They will be in bullet points to help you, focus on this text a little better, perhaps. Right? So we stop our work on this text here. From the next lectures, we will take up those that are still remaining.